Hello, everyone. Just to verify if everything works online, if there's an issue, it is time to put it in the chat. So I will be speaking in English for now, but you can also all along ask your questions in French. Enchantée. So my name is Evelyn Dion. I'm a PhD candidate and organizer here with the rest of the team doing in industrial relations at Laval University. So here I will be animating the keynote with Vinny, the other co-organizer, doctoral student at York. So to start, we are really happy and really lucky to have two incredible presenters for the keynote. So we will be starting with Dimitris Stevis, and then we will have Nora Räthzel. So first here, Dimitris Stevis has written a lot of founding work in the field of environmental labor studies. So we're really looking forward to your presentation. And right now, he's a professor at Colorado State University, doing a lot of work with a lot of people in the United States in really multidisciplinary teams. So here you have half an hour. Here you go. I might have to cut you off. If you're not disciplined, I warn you. Go ahead. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Let me share my my screen because I don't know whether you can see it. Can you see my screen, Evelyn? Because I cannot see it.
Yes, we can already see your screen. So you
can
put the slideshow.
Is there a way I can move though? I can the slides. Well, I won't be able to move. See here. Okay, maybe they will help. Just a second.
C'est quoi ça question? Ben oui, il partage dessus. Ouais.
Dimitri, you should be able to control your PowerPoint. Are you able to control the PowerPoint that you're sharing right now?
No, I'm not. I can see it down there, but I cannot control it. I was able to control it a bit earlier.
Do you want to unshare and then share again?
Okay, stop share. Okay, let me try that again. Okay. I don't know if you can see the same thing as I'm seeing, but now I can control it.
Okay. Yes, we can see it.
Yes, everything's perfect. You may go.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that how honored I am, how pleased I am to be presenting, and how unhappy I am that I cannot be there with you. I've spent the day today listening to the presentations, which were excellent, covered a lot of ground, and I learned a great deal. So I hope I can contribute something to this particular project. The goal of my presentation is really to catalyze some discussion rather than discuss empirical evidence, although it is based on empirical evidence. I want to address the two jobs narratives first, the jobs versus environment and the jobs narrative. I want to suggest a way to analyze good, green, and just jobs using the dimensions of depth, breadth, and ambition, which I'll discuss a little bit later. And I want to close by reflecting on green jobs, just transition, and political strategy to get there. Now, labor environmentalism, although it is only a tendency within the working class, has been around for a long, long time. And it comes in two varieties: labor environmentalism without job blackmail, which we'll discuss shortly, and labor environmentalism with job blackmail. So labor environmentalism is a distinct and long-standing tradition. Health and safety, of course, well known, but conservation. If you look back in time, and it's interesting and it was surprising to me that the unions, particularly logging unions in the United States and elsewhere in the world, were leaders in conservation. The Empire of Timber by Eric Loomis is an eye-opener because it allows us to understand how the spotted owl versus logging dilemma was created. Air and water, perhaps not many people know that the first largest conference on water was organized by the United Auto Workers in the 1960s. Land use, what you're seeing there is a depiction of the green bands led by construction unions in Australia. Innovation with the Lucas Combined Workers in the United Kingdom in the 1960s. Environmental justice. The first formal conference on environmental and economic justice was organized in 1976 by unionists, including the United Auto Workers. Before that, there was something called eco-justice that unfortunately is not very well known, but very inspiring. So there is a strong tradition of labor environmentalism and continues to our days. Now, there is labor environmentalism with job blackmail. This is a classic book on the subject by Kazis and Grossman. Job blackmail, of course, means that you're blackmailed about losing your job if you ask for something. And jobs versus environment is a form of job blackmail. But job blackmail is much broader than the environment. It can be about health. Communities can be blackmailed if they ask for higher taxes. It can be a variety of things. And job blackmail rises and falls depending on historical conditions. It's not permanent. When unions are stronger, when communities are stronger, it doesn't work as well. But it is compelling because it is based on power in the political economy. During the 1960s and 70s, there was an acceleration of job blackmail. And I'm just going to talk about the United States right now. I draw from that. My work does cover much of Europe, does cover Greece, of course, but I don't think Greece is a well-known place. But let me just focus here on the United States, not saying that everything has to start from the United States. But what we see in the 1970s is the rise of job blackmail with the end of the post-World War II settlement, which had allowed some kind of voice for unions in collaboration with capital and the state. After that, it expanded into coordinated capitalist countries. We heard today about what may happen to Volkswagen, and of course the global south through dictatorships and structural adjustment. So why were US unions not able to resist and reframe the hegemony of job blackmail? There were two reasons, a variety of reasons, but two important ones as far as unions go. First, the industrial unions, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, had de-radicalized, had kicked out all the radicals, and given up the right to bargain on location and technology. It gave up that right in the famous Treaty of Detroit between the UAW, United Auto Workers, and the major car manufacturers, American car manufacturers. Business unionism, the American Federation of Labor, re-emerged dominant, and it was hostile to environmentalism and other social movements that were very prominent in the 60s and 70s, very much in support of the Vietnam War. And the picture you see there is one of the most unfortunate moments in labor history where construction and building workers marched through the streets of Manhattan to beat up environmentalists and other social movement activists. But there is a second narrative in addition to jobs versus environment. It's the narrative of focusing on jobs. The term jobs, or when we start using the metric of jobs, we legitimate or we allow less ambitious approaches to eco-social change to enter the discussion. Less ambitious ones will say there are more jobs, there's 1 million jobs, or 2 million jobs, or 3 million jobs. What kind of jobs are they? That narrative is less ambitious even than green industrial policy, certainly less ambitious than just transition as envisioned by the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and the more radical elements in our days. The nature of work, what you see on the right is a picture of Lucas Combined Workers from the 1970s in the United Kingdom. They're not saying for just jobs, they're asking for socially useful work. They want to stop producing arms. And of course, eco-social political economy, broadly construed. I don't want to suggest there's one. So there are two narratives. One is the jobs versus environment, very apparent, we're aware of it, and the other is the jobs narrative. And that jobs narrative creates a metric, and metrics have a power of their own, like the gross domestic product, that drives how we think about transitions and green transitions. And it's a very comfortable one for conservative unions and, of course, capital. So jobs are in the political economy. The political economy is not an additive product where you add a bunch of jobs, but rather the nature and quantity of jobs reflect the dynamics of the political economy. Now, in our days, as was mentioned earlier, nationalization and nativism within the increasingly integrated capitalist, perhaps green, world economy fits a combustible geopolitical economy. And it brings back to what Nikolai Bukharin, perhaps not many people anymore think about Nikolai Bukharin, one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party, when he wrote a short book in 1915 or 1916 about capitalism and the world economy. And he has a chapter which has stayed with me, which was nationalization within the world economy. And this contradiction is really what's at stake here and what is driving, and hopefully we'll be able to control it, what is driving a great deal of what's happening. So the next part I want to discuss, we're done with the narratives, is to deconstruct or analyze, but I like deconstruct jobs. I propose to examine those narratives and policies of jobs in terms of their depth, breadth, and ambition. I will briefly discuss each one of them. Depth refers to the eco-social, social and ecological priorities, and breadth includes their spatial scale, and their temporal scale, but also scope, which is the demographics. Who is included in terms of society and who is excluded in terms of society and nature. Now, ambition captures the transformative potential of a particular policy. One of the things that I want to highlight in this presentation, and which drives a lot of my research, is that it is very possible to have profound depth, profound eco-social priorities, but within a narrow breadth. And that, generally speaking, reflects exploitation, whether it's the rural by the urban or the south by the north. Now, a little bit more on breadth. Historically, of course, we think of north and south in terms of geography, but in our days, we know that it really denotes rich and poor places within countries. Some incredible and interesting work done by Chancel and Piketty and others, which shows that the inequities within countries, including within countries in the global south, are more profound in terms of emissions, and more profound than the inequities between working people in the north and working people in the south. So these inequities drive the movement of precarious transnational labor from the south to the north, whether it's agriculture, construction, care, from health to beauty, all of them requiring green jobs. I mean, if you are in the beauty sector, you're an immigrant from Southeast Asia, those are toxics that you're using. If you work in health, it is really hard work, and not only in terms of the medicines and the toxics, but also physically. And of course, increasingly soldiers. A lot of countries, including the United States, recently it looks like Russia, they are hiring soldiers. The graphic you see here is Canada, and the percentage of healthcare workers in Canada that are immigrants. So I'm going to talk about now good jobs and then green jobs in terms of their breadth and in terms of their depth. Starting with depth. What can good jobs mean? A living income? Certainly, but not only. If you are paid $200 an hour to walk through Chernobyl to find out whether it's still radioactive, that's not a very good job. So we'll say that yes, a good income, that is not a job that is not dangerous and insecure. Go further, good workplace standards and benefits and pride in one's work. Further, rights and entitlements, not just workplace standards, a good human relations leader in a corporation can create a beautiful workplace. Everybody can be happy. You can work from home. You can have good health care, like in the United States. Of course, you lose it once your employment stops. That's a problem. But we want rights and entitlements in and beyond the workplace. Right to healthcare, right to education, right to leisure, right to all the kinds of things that make life worth living. And to go one step further, we want power for working people. Power to weaken capital and empower the working class. Now, what about the breadth of good jobs? Where and when are those good jobs? Are they available across the production network or just some parts of it? Do they depend on bad jobs? Are those good jobs or before or after something happens, either to clean up a disaster or to prevent a disaster? Next thing is who can have those jobs, the scope. There are sometimes explicit factors in parts of the world that prohibit certain categories of people from being employed in certain kinds of desirable sectors. But also there are implicit factors. Motherhood and caregiving are certainly working disadvantage of women. And there are also built-in biases in standards and measures. If you have to be a certain height or a certain strength, and so on, if you have to be there all the time, that really works against you. Standards and measures are really a very powerful disciplinary mechanism. What about the depth of green jobs? What can it mean? They can be green products. We can produce some green products. When the Ukraine war started, and I'm not joking about that, there was a company in the United States that felt that there should be certification for green bullets. So you can understand that it's very possible that if we just focus on green products, we might end up with some very strange configurations. We can look at the impact on workers as natural entities, occupational health and safety, perhaps. We can look at the impacts outside the workplace. And in this, I could mention the occupational health and safety agreement between ArcelorMittal and the United Steelworkers and now Industrial, which, interestingly enough, allows workers to stop production if what they're doing in the workplace pollutes communities and nature. And of course, we have to also look at the impacts of products. The impacts of products can be good, but also they can be bad, directly. Extraction, toxicity, obsolescence. But they can also be bad environmentally, indirectly, by displacing better options. What you see on the right there is public versus private transportation. As other people have mentioned, we can have all those extraordinarily interesting individual cars, but once we have them, we have more highways, we have more sprawl, we have the creation of problems that cannot be solved in 1 or 2 generations any longer. There is, of course, the breadth of green jobs. People have spoken about that already. Are those green jobs available across the production network? Do they depend on gray jobs? Who can have those green jobs? Again, the same thing. There are explicit factors and implicit factors that affect who gets those green jobs. I want to briefly talk about intersections of scale and scope. It's possible to have a narrow scale and narrow scope, jobs in a particular place, green jobs for men in a city. You can have narrow scale and a broad scope, green jobs for all in a city. Broad scale and narrow scope, we're talking about breadth now, green jobs for men globally, and broad scale and broad scope, green jobs for all globally. And the reason I mention that is I think that scales and scopes are created, and unless we think about them systematically, and I'm not saying this is the best way to do so, it is so easy to be caught in this whole discussion of good green jobs. The C40 big cities are big on that. Now, another 2x2 that I love them. They organize my mind, and I want to thank Brendan Davidson for this. That you can have, and we're using an analytical scheme that Katie Crowley, who did some very good work on green jobs in the 1990s in Australia. You can have light green jobs, not very, not much depth, and light blues, like installing solar panels safely. You have light green jobs and deep blue, installing solar panels with project labor agreements, like we have in offshore wind. Project labor agreements are good, but they're not the most ambitious kind of labor policy. You can have deep green and light blue, sustainable building without unionization. A lot of discussion about sustainable building. And of course, deep green and deep blue public transportation with worker and community agency. So, just good green jobs. What is a just good green job and why do we need it? There are good green jobs in a place or time that do not depend on bad or great jobs across space and time. That is, that they don't externalize harm. They externalize something good. They lead to upward harmonization. And there are good green jobs for some, there are good green jobs for some parts of humanity or nature that are not at the expense of other parts. And why do we need them? Because hitherto subaltern workers that have been excluded can inflict serious damage on hitherto core workers. And because reshoring green jobs is another's offshoring of jobs. You know, there's so much discussion in Europe, in the United States, big climate policies, the IRA and so on, to reshore supply chains. To reshore supply chains because presumably if we reshore them, there will be less social and environmental damage. But that's just another form of nationalism. I recall interviewing a United Steelworker activist who told me the very poignant story when the Midwest was being de-industrialized. A number of unions went to Brazil to start discussions of solidarity with steel workers there. And one of the steel workers told him, basically, you are now in the position we were all those years, but you didn't listen to us. So basically, that's something that we need to take into account. Subaltern workers in a changing global division of labor can cause much more serious damage to core workers than was the case in the past. And that's something that workers in the core should take into account. So jobs and unjust transitions. Green jobs can very well contribute to an unjust transition. If they're superficially green, if they are superficial or not green, if they are superficial or not good. And importantly, when they are limited to privileged places, externalizing bad and great jobs across production networks, limited to particular workers, communities, and natures in those privileged places, and they reinforce job blackmail and thus resentment and divisions. In general, just transitions, and this is something I want to highlight, must focus more on people and nature accounting and less on job counting. There has been this extraordinary discussion of green jobs that goes back to the 1990s. It exploded the first decade of the millennium, and then it exploded again more recently. And all it does is count for jobs. It does not take into account what happens to people who lose their jobs. Can people move? What happens to families? What happens to the lives of people? And in my own research, when I interviewed people, both for the Just Transition Listening Project and also with respect to the Just Transition in Colorado, the top concern of most workers, and this is a surprising part, was not work. It was healthcare, because in the United States, we do not have socialized healthcare. It's attached to your employment. You lose your healthcare, you get sick, you go bankrupt, and that's it. So people accounting, taking care of people as a whole, taking care of communities as a whole. Job counting is necessary, but is far from being sufficient, particularly since most of those green jobs are not in the places where people are losing their jobs. So what is to be done? Number one, resist nationalist narratives of good green jobs, often couched in egalitarian terms. We see that in the United States, we see that in Canada, we see that in Europe, and so on. Advance labor rights and solidarity across green communities of faith without othering. I keep reading all this literature on supply chains and labor, the discussions of why we want to reshore critical minerals and so on. And we keep this whole reference, talking about the United States now, the fact that the rest of the world has lower environmental standards and lower labor standards. I never hear the fact that the reason why we have such a disastrous situation in terms of labor in the United States is because of the US South. We don't ever hear that German unionists call the US South their Mexico. And we don't hear that it has taken forever to unionize automobile companies in the US South. So I think it's very important to note other. It's important to promote political collaboration amongst eco-social unions and other eco-social forces. It's important to advance eco-social politics within the world of labor. That's a very, very, very big task. And it's also important to separate counter-hegemonic forces from those that dress hegemonic power in counter-hegemonic language. Transformation, transformation, transformation. Everybody, including corporations. It's common to greenwashing that a number of you have discussed. And to close, I think we need to craft local, national, and transnational policies that drive upward harmonization. We don't need to be maximalist. Local and sectoral policies can be internationalist and can drive upward harmonization. There's variety of local and sectoral policies. To support structural reforms, or what Gores called non-reformist reforms, towards a democratic public sphere and politics for the common good, rather than reforms that prevent it, whether directly through oppression or indirectly through corporate social responsibility. And to follow with one of the most recent presenters, build comprehensive political organizations in addition to tactical and strategic alliances. In my view, we need internationalist political parties within and across countries. And we have not, unfortunately, been doing very well in that regard. And we have not been focusing on that. Certainly in the United States, there's much more focus on alliances than this kind of political organizations that political parties reflect. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Dimitris. That was excellent. Very thought-provoking. Yep, so now we're just going to move on to our other keynote speaker that we are very excited to have in person, Nora Räthzel, and they are out of a researcher at Umeå University in Sweden, and their title of their talk is Workers as Agents of a Transformative Just Transition, the Everyday versus Utopias of Hope. Thanks a lot.
And thank you very much for having me here and inviting me here. What? Oh, the mic has to be, I have to do it on my level, right? Bit short. So thank you very much again for the invitation and for inviting me to such a great place. I was, not outside the place, inside the place where you did the presentations. That's what I found very exciting today. I was really happy to listen to all this fantastic work that people are doing. As you see, I changed a little bit the title of my talk, because when you do the thing, in hindsight, you find out, no, the title has to change. So you will understand it at the end, why the title is The Real is Process, Concrete Utopias. Okay, this is a nice sound, but it doesn't move. Okay. It moves too fast. This is just the introduction to say that the three main discourses that exist in environmental labor studies, as we have also listened to today, is about trade unions fighting for good jobs. It's about research on the relationship between class relations and the climate crisis, showing how the profit principle is really the reason why we are in such a crisis. And then one of the other main discourses is about climate justice, justice for marginalized groups. And so they can be indigenous groups, they can be racialized groups, can be women, and other kind of marginalized groups. So I think those discourses and struggles are extremely important. But something is missing. And I think one thing that is missing that was mentioned already twice or more times today is how can rank and file workers become the agents of the transitions, not just the trade union representatives, which are very, very important for this, but also what about the workers on the shop floor? And one example, of course, was the Lucas workers, where the trade unions that organized the workers in order to develop alternative forms of production said, instead of gearing up my members to react to management decisions, I was encouraging them to embrace the idea of alternatives to aerospace work. Thankfully, that's not just a thing of the past, of history. There are also workers today who are thinking in that way about creating, for instance, workers' assemblies. And I'm going to read you the quotes from their work. Aviation is heading for a crash landing. The projected growth of aviation is incompatible with safe levels of global warming. This needs to change, which means we'll need to change how we fly. So we need to develop an independent worker-led vision of the future for aviation. So it's great to listen to aviation workers saying that we have to fly less. It exists. And then we have, of course, the very famous GKN workers in Firenze. I guess all of you have already heard about them, that they not only occupied the factory where they were fired from for 3 years now, but they also developed ways in which they could convert their production process into one that is environmentally and socially more just. For instance, producing cargo bikes and also solar panels. And they're already connected also with the workers, with the aviation workers we saw before. So there is something happening there on an international perspective, which is very important. It's small, but it's important that it's happening. Okay, this is stopped working. Doesn't like me anymore. Come on. No, yeah. So that's why I do these funny things, you know. So what is still missing? And it's also something that the Firenze workers put on their struggles, which is thinking about another way of living, not just another way of working. So here is one example that they organized readings, they organized concerts, they organized discussions about the working class is queer in order to connect to other groups. And so we need to ask a broader question. That's my main thesis. Not only how do we want to work, but how do we want to live and work? And this is, for example, again, the Firenze workers who put up this poster. Abbiamo fame di un mondo nuovo. We are hungry for another world. And some of our colleagues, no, this is not what I wanted to say. So the reason why we have to think about another way of living, not only another way of working, is because the way in which we are at the moment greening the economy is just shifting the destruction from the output of the production process to the input of the production process, namely all the minerals that are needed and the extractivism. And we heard fantastic presentations about that this afternoon, so I don't have to go into detail about that. So, but still, here is the list of the minerals we need, not only for the renewables, but also for the digitalization of work and the way in which they are destroying people, planet, animals, and the natural support system for our life. I'm not going into details. I'm just giving one example, which is just a silver mine. This is the second biggest silver mine in Mexico and the fifth biggest silver mine in the world. And it's 103 square kilometers, which is like 19,249 football fields. And I just put that in order to imagine that. And a friend of mine who is a footballer, he said, nobody can imagine 19,000 football fields. You know, it's a stupid idea to put it there. But you can see what happens: deforestation, destruction of ecosystem, loss of biodiversity, and loss of carbon sinks. And this is another image that shows so nicely how this works, maybe. So you see, this is just a dam for toxic sludge held back by a wall of 11.26 kilometers circumference, as high as 47-story buildings. And you can see the small little dots there on it is this kind of machine, which is quite big when you compare it to the workers that are driving it. Yeah? Just to give you an idea, this is just one silver mine. And if we would shift all the energy that we have now without even increasing it to renewables, we would need 130 more mines of that scale. And that's just silver. So that's why we need to think of another way of living, consuming, and working, not just about jobs, although it's very important. So therefore, we have to think in a more utopian way, but not utopia as an ideally perfect place or as a fantasy or as an idealistic scheme, but more in the way in which Ernst Bloch, a German philosopher, thought about it, concrete utopias. And I'm going to read that to you because it's quicker than explaining it. So he says, every object of moral metaphysical expression is thus simultaneously the reality that has not yet been fully achieved, that nonetheless is already compelling, essential, utopian, ultimately so real reality. So what is very important for this concept of utopia is that it is something that is already there in reality. It's not just coming out of our heads like that, although what comes out of our heads is already there in reality as well. But it's something that has not been accomplished, but is always being tried in the past and in the present and wants to be fulfilled, so to speak. So nothing could be altered in accordance with wishes if the world were closed, full of fixed, even perfected facts. Instead of these, there are simply processes. So the real is process. The latter is the widely ramified mediation between present, unfinished past, and above all, possible future. And then there is somebody you will all know of, Eric Olin Wright, who also promoted this idea of utopia. He called it real utopias. And for him, it was to find in the real life already institutions that challenged the way in which domination works in our societies. So to find what is already there and how that could be developed further. So it's this kind of utopias that we're looking for. And that need for utopias is very vivid in the degrowth community, which I'm a bit part of, especially since living close to Barcelona, you cannot but be part of it because it's very strong there. And one colleague wrote here, the change of individual values and behavior should be the main target in degrowth. I prefer Marx, who said, we do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. So, and therefore we need to listen. And that's what we tried to do in our last project, where we organized workshop for trade unionists, 3 in the UK, in Cardiff, in Glasgow, and in Wortley, and 3 in Spain, in Baeza, in Madrid, and in Barcelona. All in all, in those workshops, we had about 80 people, and they were trade unionists from all sectors and all different kinds of work, but they were all trade unionists who were working on the shop floor still, you know, not just full not just, I mean, it's bad to say just, but we wanted to work with people who could develop an alternative way of producing in their workplaces. So the title of the workshop was Workers Analyzing the Ecological Footprint of Their Workplace and Developing Alternatives. And the first method that we used was asking people to draw an image of the world as it's now and to draw an image of the world they want to live in. Of course, many of them didn't like that so much, to draw an image, but in the end, they did it together. They sat in little groups and drew their images of the world they want to live in. Here, for instance, you can see an example of how this image is taking shape. And I will show you how they described their images or part of their images. The sound is not very good. We recorded the whole workshops, so we have a lot of data, but I thought it's better for you to listen to them, and you can read the text at the same time, if it works.
On this idea of individualism. So this is everyone in their respective silos, where you go into the silo with people, with the same people who think the thing as you do, then you shut the door and you just fight off against each other in this space. But what we really need is for the door to be open and for people to be willing to come together and take part in dialogues. So this here we would think of more, we would like to see more democracy, strong democracy happening at sort of like local and regional levels, things like citizens' assemblies, the people themselves participating in budget decisions, local authority planning. This here, I don't know how well everyone can see it, but it's a drawing of the world, and the first pictures, ours and some other people's, had money at the top. So what we've done here is we've put currency symbols at the side, and we've put arrows to show that the money should flow equally around the world, as opposed to being the thing that we prioritise. And instead we prioritise people and planet. And then all these different things here represent different ways in which we can communicate with each other and the structures that would give rise to this. So that was one of the things that you asked us to look at. So we said that what would be good would be the different colours of stick people represent all the different people in the world. And what's happening here is the love hearts represent more harmony and more respect between people. And the dialogue represents just that, dialogue. But Hugh said, which is crucial, it's still okay to have conflict. Right, we're not just being like, let's just all hold hands and go around the world and sing Kumbaya and plant some trees and it'll all be grand. Like, it's fine to have conflict and disagreement, but we don't do it like this. When we're in the silo with the door shut, we have conflict and disagreement, but it ends up harmonious, and somewhere we're moving towards a better goal.
We were kind of thinking about that thing you were saying about maybe not working so much. So we were putting more of the emphasis on this picture. So this is like, you know, if you were working, no matter what you're doing, whether you work in a factory or you work with a computer. And this idea of money coming first, and the idea of kind of infinite growth, things have always got to be bigger and better. So if you kind of thought less about that, then you have more time to focus on, well, it's a house, but it's your own individual house. It's like what you do your spare time, things that you like to do. So if we didn't have so much of this, we could maybe have a bit more of this. People could have a wee bit more time to sort of breathe easy and think about what they want and get together and maybe make bigger changes because they've got more time, so they're not having to work, think about things and socialise and pursue their hobbies and have a more holistic life. You need to get rid of these things first to get.
So next step, I'm going to go through 3 of the main things that people drew about and then mentioned in the presentation of their images. And the first one is, of course, greening energy. And here you have, I took out different parts from the images. So you have just transition, of course, and you have carbon capture and sequestration, and you have planes flying with different kinds of fuel. And you have a turbine on your own house. So you can interpret these elements in a very different way. I mean, there's a double-edged sword. Like, for instance, just transition can be just like Dimitris was talking about, a very flat idea of just having good jobs. But if you think about it in a more deeper way, just transition is also a perspective of a different kind of living and a different kind of society. Because in a capitalist society, you cannot really have justice and a just transition because the power relations do not allow it. So you would have to struggle very hard in order to make your voice not only heard, but also democratize the workplace. And the other idea of having the wind turbine on your house is also a kind of utopian idea of decentralizing energy, people themselves being in control of the energy that they use and they need, instead of just having the state or capitalist owning the energy sources. And then there is, of course, also the idea of this technological fixes with the capture of carbon capture. Goodness, Nora. So I'm not going to go into details because we had discussions about that in the afternoon as well. The other element that was talked about most was locality. So here you have some examples, of course, locally buying your food and your grocery on the market. And that is an utopian idea in the sense that local shops are not working according to the profit principle. They're not growing all the time. You know, they just have that, what they need for their people in their locality. And it has also a political impetus, local and accountable political representation. And again, you have this nice image with the houses which have their own wind turbines. But it can also be a form of escapism, like, for instance, in the very left here, where you have your own house, you do your own growing of food, you have your own animals, and you have no money and you have nobody around. So you have this ideal, harmonious house for yourself. You're going to be really lonely after a while. And therefore, one of the other most talked about, I think maybe the most talked about element was collectivity, cooperation, anti-individualism, and also different images and different ideas about this, like, for instance, collective community as a safety net. So you don't depend on the state, on a welfare state. You depend only on your community, which creates your safety. Or friendships between different kinds of people, but also an economic perspective about workers as owners of the workplace and having cooperatives. And also the idea of making music and theater or listening to it together as a community action. The cross that you see there with the black guy, the black figure, is individualism, so crossed out individualism, and instead all the ideas that people have, they go together into this cloud. But the collectivity also had an international perspective, so you have a global action and you fight together for all the good and necessary things that you need in the world. And here you have two pictures. I was thinking that we could discuss them together, but maybe we don't have the time and the energy anymore. So it's just to show you how rich these people, yes, and the pictures were, that they thought almost about everything that you need in society. So this one is from Cardiff, and this one is from Spain. And so the Spanish one, you have agriculture, you have animals, you have the train, you have residence, is the residence for old people. And then if you look down here, you have the school, you have the university, you have a water cleaning plant, and you have no cars. You see? No cars. And And in the Cardiff picture, you have also education, lifelong learning, what we had about cooperatives owning the companies, and less working. That was also in almost all the images. People want to work less and live more. So all in all, you can say it's a degrowth perspective. And that we did this method before we talked to people. So it's not the result of the workshop. It's how the workshops began before we even said anything. So why am I showing this? It's just the beginning of analyzing those data. I'm showing that to show that some of the problems that we have as organizers, and I would say trade union organizers and academics even more, is that we think we have to educate people and change their values instead of listening to what people already want and to connect to that. Because in a way, when we only ask about, okay, what job do you want to have and are you afraid to lose your job, you only get those answers, which are important, but they're also limited. But if you ask people, how do you want to live? You get a much more complex picture and you get an idea of a more simple life that people really want. So the question is how we connect to these desires that people have in order to build, let's say, a revolutionary, transformative movement for another way of living and working. And I will almost ending now. So this is what we gave them as a task at the end of the drawing. They should say in one sentence what the task is to get to this utopian place. And this is just one example where somebody wrote to begin a process to develop the cooperative and sharing economy in order to confront the challenge of socially useful work, equitable exchange, and community wealth building. Good utopia. And so I'm finished now, but I want to finish with a song, which is from a French singer called Barbara. I don't know if anybody knows her. She was French. She has died some time ago, unfortunately, but we all will. And I also want to pay tribute to the French part in which we are here staying. So the images of the video I don't like so much, but that was the only video I found which had English subtitles. So here we go.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dimitris and Nora. So here we have a good half an hour if you want to ask any questions and discuss. So I'm really happy we're going to have so much time to talk. So I just want to first maybe ask Dimitris a question, if you'll allow me, and then can open up and please inform me if there's anything that pops up in the chat. But I'm wondering right now, considering the political climate in the United States, especially with the recent developments, if you think that maybe something that would have a narrower scope, but a broader, something with a narrow scale and a wide scope, if it could be something more of a solution, if I might say, to the current solution to addressing the limitations that are, seeing. And I think it might go a little bit with what Nora is saying, but I would like to hear you about it, or if you think that it might be more counterproductive to go this way.
That's a very important question. I recall about 8 years ago in the fall of 2017, when Trump was elected. At the time, I was collaborating with a Canadian project, and we had a number of events on environmental politics in dark times, we call them, and just try to discuss and think about how, what's going to happen. And there are probably a lot of strategies. I don't have a specific strategy to suggest at this point, but what I would recommend against this is anticipatory disciplining. That is, ourselves, in anticipation of what will happen, closing down our options, closing out our possibilities. I think it's better to see what there is that we can build on the basis of which not only can we resist, but advance. And there is a lot. First of all, it turns out that the victory of Trump is really marginal. It's a very marginal one in the House and the Senate and the population. However, I think that the alliance that Trump does lead is a dangerous one. It's also combustible. There are a lot of differences within that. So we'll see what happens. So I am concerned, but I'm not concerned enough to basically say that we need to adjust our strategies so much to him. I think we need to adjust our strategies to how do we recalibrate the United States and beyond the United States, the world, in a more eco-socialist or social democratic direction. That's why I brought up the question of a political party. I know in the United States, having a third party is very, very problematic, but I think it's long overdue building a third party for the long term.
Great.
I don't know if that answers your question, or maybe avoids it, but
Perfect. Thanks so much, Dimitris. And maybe I'll use my privilege as a chair to ask Nora a question before we open it up. Very strange feelings going through my body there when I heard the Glaswegian accent. I didn't realise that I think I was the only one that didn't need the subtitles for that. Oh, that's so self-deprecating, but that's been Glaswegian. Anyway, yeah, so my question is, when you spoke to the workers, did they talk about how they envisioned winning their utopias? Did they talk about what they seen as? Because I think so many people, and what kind of Dimitris points to is the disenfranchisement of like the population is very much a story we're not talking so much about in terms of how the right is winning by disenfranchising working class voters, nihilism, etc. So was there like a conversation, was there a way they talked about how they envisioned winning their utopias would be my question. Thanks.
So the workshops always went for 4 or 5 days. So we talked almost about everything, as you can imagine. And actually, especially the group in Glasgow was kind of depressed about the way in which they have been losing so many battles and so many struggles. And we talked about that, and the people, the one of us who were organizing the workshops from Sweden and Spain, we thought that there was, especially in Glasgow, a kind of gloom also about that, right? But on the other hand, it was also the group that had done research with oil workers and interviewed oil workers about what they want, and found out that, for instance, 85% of the oil workers do not want to be oil workers. They want to do something else and live in a different way. So I think you had both perspectives. You had an opening up about what do we want and just, think into the blue, but you also had the history of how do you say now? English words are not coming to me. How they lost struggles, about losses. And I hope that through talking to each other, which was the most important thing of those workshops, because people came from all different places, they didn't know each other, and they were really happy to find so many workers from different trade unions who wanted to do something with an environmental perspective. So I hope that through just coming together, they were able to overcome a little bit of that gloom.
Thank you so much. We can open up to the floor if you have any questions, or online if anybody has written. Yes, great.
Thank you. These were wonderful keynotes. So thank you very much, organizers, and for Dimitris and Nora for the presentations. Dimitris, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the job blackmail and some additional examples of how certain industries have deliberately pitted, say, environmental justice against employment. Or is that something that just kind of looms over these industries? I'm really curious of how the industries themselves might have played that card historically and maybe in more recent years as a way of undermining workers' connections with those particular environmental or social justice movements.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You know, this the framing and the jobs versus environment, of course, was created in the 1970s. It was not accidental. It was a counter movement by the Nixon administration, and based on a document or a planning document that was prepared by one of the people that eventually became a Supreme Court justice, the Powell Memorandum. And generally, Nixon was very upset with the fact that in the late 80s and early 70s, he had to deal with a strong environmental movement. So it was an organized counter-hegemonic movement. And it was also, interestingly enough, many of the people that participated in this movement, they had been working for a long time, since the 1930s, against the New Deal. I mean, they thought of the New Deal that Roosevelt had created as a horrible thing, and they had been planning for a long, long time, utilizing an alliance between conservative Christians and business and what have you, to fight back against the New Deal. And then in the 60s and 70s, the environment was added to that. So the environment was something that they also took over. So yes, it was not accidental. The framing is not accidental. It was part and parcel of the breakdown of the post-World War II settlement and the fact that at that particular time, the environment was prominent. That's what I want to say, though. There was also the same kind of thing appeared with respect to gender rights. Phyllis Schlafly, perhaps of you some have heard of her, a very conservative activist. That's when she became very prominent. And in general, of the movement against the right of communities to actually fight back against corporations who would pit one community against the other. So yes, this was not just something that fell from the sky. This was not an accidental thing. This was a counter movement by capital and its allies and the Republican Party and the elements of the Democratic Party in the southern United States, because that's one of the things that's very, very important. The US South, that we often think of as this isolated, backwards place, starting in the 1950s in a very systematic, I don't know if you all realize, the US South, like Tennessee, Alabama, those kinds of places, right? Georgia. Starting in the 1950s and more aggressively in the 60s, were very, very, very aggressively courting businesses to move there, claiming that what they had is no unions and eventually no environmental laws, that you could do what you wanted, essentially. And to this day, in fact, they keep, even if there's a company that wants to allow unionization, they threaten them. So just to make to shorten the answer a little bit, yes, it was not accidental, but it's very important to realize that the jobs versus environment, the environmental part, is not only one manifestation. There's jobs versus bringing women to the labor force, jobs versus more healthcare, jobs versus communities asking for more social license fees and more taxes for schools and what have you. That's what I want to make, that it is not the only thing. It's part and parcel of this broader job blackmail. I don't know if that answers your question. Doesn't? I hope it raises at least.
Thanks very much. Two great presentations, lots of things to think about. My name is Mark Hudson. I'm from the University of Manitoba. just a little ways to the west of here. And I wonder if you might both comment a little bit on what it is that successful organizers and organizations who are pushing for the kinds of transformations you're both talking about, and I get the sense that maybe those are slightly different kinds of transformations, what they can expect in terms of counter movement. And it connects, I think, a little bit to Andrew's question about what we could expect from employers. But Dimitri, you kind of mentioned the de-radicalization of the CIO early on, and you know, of course, the CIO partly did that as an internal move, but you know, there was this very, very long and extremely aggressive policing of labor organizing, and especially socialist and communist labor organizers were the ones that were pinpointed. They basically sort of targeted the most capable kinds of organizers, especially for democratic forms of socialism, and exiled them or arrested them or blackmailed them or, you know, basically excluded them in other ways. Of course, we see successful organizers in the global south are targeted all the time. If they're land and environment defenders, we see those folks getting targeted as well. And so, Nora, in the context of, so I guess, Dimitri, for your part, as we kind of move away from thinking about, you know, a shallowness, a kind of a liberal version of green jobs into something that would be deeper, that would actually challenge power relations and the prerogatives of capital to determine what kind of work we do. What should organizers expect by way of pushback, both from states and from employers? And I guess, Nora, your vision is very much a kind of a grassroots vision of building from below and in sort of building the world that we want to see. And I guess the same question would apply as a kind of an autonomous kind of vision of, well, we can just sort of create the world we want, and that's how it will result in transformation. And I apologize, that's a simplistic, of course, explanation, but there's a sort of an element, I think, of that in there. So in addition to the just sort of current backlash that we're getting from the right, how do organizers do this in a way that doesn't open them up to like really extreme forms of danger and hazard, and what can we expect by way of pushback from elites?
Nora, do you want to
we
go
have
first?
in the chat of the Zoom, so Räthzel is going to read it.
All right, so quick question from the chat, so we can answer to both of them. All right, so this one is from Varun Bhatt for Dr. Stevis. How does one account for or consider green climate jobs being away from centers of small towns and cities when it comes to measuring adaptation success, especially for cities who had an employment decline post-industrial era and are now slowly generating more employment opportunities thanks to climate adaptation plans?
Okay. Well, maybe I can connect the comment, this comment and the comment that was made earlier. Let me start by saying, how are union organizers, how are they going to avoid the wrath of people who don't want them to be around? I think it varies from place to place. It's a very serious question. That's where I think that building systematic alliances, and as I said earlier on, I mean, I know that it sounds utopian in the United States to think about a third party. And it's a long-term process, but somehow I think that's necessary, because otherwise we're going to be returning to the same thing every 4 years or every 8 years. But let me go back to try to answer to comment, or not answer, to comment the question that you posed, and Varun. I have come to the conclusion that if we are going to say this is a very, very bad moment in American politics, a very, very bad moment in terms of the environment and labor in the United States. Therefore, even though there may be opportunities in Colorado, let's say, or in Illinois, or in California, for good green jobs, or for moving towards eco-social policy at the level of the state, and American states are very significant, but we shouldn't do it And we shouldn't try to unionize because that will upset the right wing. I think that basically we have self-defeated ourselves. And if environmentalists or advocates of green capitalism or advocates of green business are not happy with it, even though they quite frequently they use the language of transformation, maybe we have to make the decision that, in fact, their goal is to keep change taking place. So there are places in the United States, there are cities, there are states, there are sectors where, in fact, you can create these islands of change, not just resistance, islands of change. But I think, and I'm concerned, that green capital will grab the opportunity, and the green capital and also the Democratic Party, parts of the Democratic Party, to say, don't be too uppity, don't be too radical, because if you're too radical, we're going to lose everything. And at the end of the day, 4 years from now, 6 years from now, we will not have much. Because personally, I don't trust green capital, or at least extreme green capital, any more than I trust fossil capital. And there's good reasons for that. And I think environmentalists, that I work with environmentalists a great deal, and environmental justice people, they need to realize that workers are important. One of the things I tell people, and I'm going to stop there, is that when we think about the world, the largest category of people in the world, other than other species, is human beings. The second largest category is citizens of some country or another. And the third largest category is working people, meaning people that cannot survive if they lose their job for any more than 2 or 3 months. If environmentalists, if the rest of the world cannot realize that, well, I think it's incumbent upon us to put it front and center. We're talking about working people, and working people account for the largest number of people in the United States and around the world. Many more, and these are the people we are working with and for, and this is what we are.
Yeah, maybe to just continue on that. I mean, I don't think that the grassroots perspective will save us on its own, right? I just think that it is a necessary part, and it's a part that is pretty much neglected in trade union environmental policies, as far as I have researched them in different countries of the global North and South. So, starting from the grassroots is not to do only that, but to connect that with the necessary organizational power that trade unions have. I recently did a very long interview with one of the workers, because we're doing a massive open online course on the basis of our data. So, and for that, we're doing a lot of new interviews with the people we already met at the workshops. So, he's an educator in the trade unions, and he described very well the power and the necessity of institutions and organizations in order to have a stability and especially historical development of organizing, right? So what I think is necessary is a combination of starting to listen, asking broader questions, and integrating that in the already existing organizations. And there are some examples for that. I always keep talking about how the Spanish trade union is really one of the, at least the best in the world that I know about environmental issues, and nobody wants to believe that because people think only the Swedes are the best. Everybody in the north is the best i världen. But in fact, it's the South that is much better. And why? Not because they are the South or so have a lot of temperament and all that stuff, because they have a different history of workers' struggles and their political struggles encompassing not only the trade union cooperation between trade unions and the CEOs and the management, but trade union struggle for a different kind of society, and like, for instance, the Spanish trade unions came developed out of the struggle against fascism, against Franco. And that kind of history is very important for the kind of radicalism that can develop in an organizing way for environmental issues as well. And the least capable trade unions of developing a struggle for an alternative way of living and working.
May I add something that I didn't respond to Varun as much as I should have? Can I take a minute?
The mic just died.
Dimitris, I haven't finished yet, only the mic.
Oh, you haven't? I'm sorry, I thought you had. Oh.
So, but I'm almost finished. So I want, in my
experience. No rush. I just thought you had.
Yep, it's okay. And in my experience, not just experience, but in the research we've done since 2006 on trade unions, the trade unions that have most difficulties to developing an alternative perspective are those who are very well entrenched and organized in bargaining with management. Like, for instance, in Sweden, you know, they have very good arrangements. You give me that, and then I give you that, right? And that is such a kind of trajectory that the Swedish trade unions, for instance, are all 100% on green growth, technological solutions, and we're going to be the best in the world again and export all our green technologies, and we will grow more than ever, right? And the Germans are in between. And so that kind of, and I don't know how to produce that, you know, you cannot produce a history. So I think the perspective is, how can you strengthen the kind of grassroots and trade union organization developments that are going into an alternative direction in a way that they can then, in alliance with other groups, and that's a very important thing, alliance with environmental groups. For instance, for the Firenze workers, it was decisive that they worked together with Fridays for Future in Italy, and that helped them to develop an alternative. And that helped also the Fridays for Future people to think about workers and to say, we will not allow any layoffs of workers with green arguments. We will defend workers' jobs, you know, so they learned from each other. So these kind of things, the history, the way of doing alliances, breaking out of the trajectory of just doing bargaining with management, I think these are essential ways of bringing us forward. But they're not very well developed yet, I must say.
Okay. Oh, so it works. So thanks a lot for your presentations. So my name is Christian Pépin. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at UCO in this very university. So I wanted to ask a question around, I took your point, Dimitris, about the fact that we need to go beyond this narrow conception of green jobs, right? So how do we move? So my question will be around, how do we move from a moment where workers just see themselves as recipients of jobs or recipients as green jobs waiting to be delivered by the state or by employers or even by their own trade union representatives? And how do we move from that moment to a moment where workers see themselves as actual agents of eco-social change? And something we discuss, me and Nora on the way, and I want to fledge that out a bit more, is a lot of the time when workers move from that moment to a more radical kind of transformative vision is in moments of crisis, moments where the jobs on which people dependent on NOLA is threatened, right? In moments of mass layoffs, in moment of corporate-led restructuring, and how we see these corporations which used this ecological transitions at even a lever to further their neoliberal restructuring of their industries, right? So my question around this is how crisis doesn't always lead to the same responses. So for example, in the 2007 and 8 crisis, we've seen, for example, auto workers accept concessions as a means to preserve their jobs. While in other moments, we can see Green Jobs Oshawa, where in the context of losing their job, they think about how to reimagine in the same way of the GKN workers' house. So what I would like you to fledge out is what are the kind of union traditions and capacities that needs to be developed so that in moments of crisis, we don't get concessions or an unjust transition, but we actually get this more transformative. And just lastly, my situated knowledge may be very fragmented because of this organizing that over the conference, but maybe it was all already answered before in another talk, but a lot of you kind of talk about how we need this kind of international solidarity across borders and across the whole global working class. Could you give us what are the most promising examples that you've seen in research that are really advancing this kind of global solidarity across borders and across the kind of supply chains that you've seen? Maybe just give us the beacons of hope in that direction.
We're going to take a last question, and then you could close.
Thank you so very much for your talks. Really, really interesting. And I come from biodiversity conservation, so I actually learned a lot about the labor movement today. And my question is about what, if any, role do you see for non-humans in these green job transitions, the just transitions? In biodiversity conservation, I work on, what is the place of other species in society and things like that, and in the biodiversity conservation efforts. So I was wondering, especially Nora, with those utopias and those drawings and animals being so prominent in a lot of those images. So what does the future of work look like if we were to maybe include those non-humans in a way or another, in a way where they have more agency than they do currently? I know it's kind of a big question, but any thoughts would be appreciated. Thanks again.
Dimitris can start. Dimitris?
Okay.
Yep.
All right. My turn? You want me to talk?
Yes, go ahead for the answer.
Okay. All right. Yeah, about the organizing a crisis, I'm just going to very briefly, we have this sense that only certain kinds of workers and unions have equity in this green transition. But let us think for a second, and to indicate where change can come from. Let us for a moment think about cities and think about what is the largest number of people in cities, and what do they work in? Where they work in universities, in schools, in hospitals, in other kinds of public services. And and this is not my idea, this is from somebody called Winant, you're familiar with. He's a unionist in the education sector. But let us say for a second that the unions in those sectors, and I want to connect it also to climate adaptation plans, the question that Varun said, that they said, we want a city where energy is provided that is clean energy, is green energy with unionized processes and properly provided. We're talking about 25 to 30% of the population of each city could be in unions like that. So when I see the service unions, including the union I'm part of, the American Federation of Teachers, finally adopt a climate policy, I'm hopeful, because I think it's very, very important to realize that one can change and address this particular issue, not only in moments of crisis, but in moments of non-crisis, by switching our frame. So if the service unions at this particular, all hospitals, schools, all those that provide services were to say, we're going to work only in places that are socially and environmentally sound, that could have an amazing impact, because those industries account for a significant part of energy consumption, a massive amount of energy consumption. So that's one thing. And so talking about the climate adaptation plans, they're good, provided that, in fact, they are both socially good and environmentally good, because it is very possible, and I think risky, when cities start competing with each other about who is going to attract particular kinds of investments. I'm not as familiar with that, Varun, so I'm going to read about it a little bit more. With respect to solidarity, I think one has to look long and hard, but you can find examples of solidarity. That's why I was talking about the US South within the United States, within Europe. And I think that there's a lot of research about supply chains and solidarity in supply chains. There was a big discussion that you're probably all familiar with when the Rama Plaza fell down. There was the approach taken by the Walmarts of the world, and there was the approach that was taken by unions to build kind of solidarity and policy across boundaries. We don't have as many as we should, but we need to identify those kinds of instances. But there's a lot of interesting research and a lot of interesting practice, and that's why I mentioned that practice sometimes others. That is, means we are going to go out there to those parts of South Asia or Africa where people do not have good labor standards and rights, because we in the United States, I'm not talking about Europe, I'm talking about Canada. I know Canadians are much better than the United States. I'm not talking about Greeks either. We need to realize that we have a lot of problems ourselves, and we have a lot of problems because a lot of the workers in our own countries, which are immigrants, transnational workers, are being abused. And last comment, I'm glad you raised the question of the non-humans. It's of great interest to me. I think I've been working that area. I know Nora has been working in that area. My point and my approach, and maybe that we can discuss some other time, is that ultimately it is human beings that unfortunately at this point in time decide what the status of nature is. Not that we should decide, not that nature doesn't have intrinsic value, not that it is not important for us to be regulated as human beings, but we should never forget that there is no privileged natural standpoint. There is no person, no group that somehow has a privileged communication with nature other than our own human nature. And this is where I sometimes, because I teach environmental politics, that's how I make my money, not labor politics. That's a debate that I have with my colleagues and collaborators, that sometimes we colonize nature in an effort to protect and empower nature.
Hope. My title was first Utopian Hope, and I took the hope away. I was very hopeful in those workshops to discover the richness of ideas and perspectives that people have. And the sad thing about it is that there is no structure at the moment where these ideas and hopes and these wishes that people have. There were also talks about we want to be within nature, and nature should not be outside somewhere, but it's part of our everyday life. So it wasn't these images and the way in which people describe them. So I think the hope is that there is a lot of potential. And the question is how can the trade unions and we all together and the environmental movements listen to that potential and help that potential to become the reality that needs to become. And just so going back to the Firenze workers, I mean, it's a problem that we always go back to this one example because there are not so many examples. But one also has to say that the Italian trade union at the beginning supported them, but now does not support them anymore so much because they think, oh, they're going to lose that struggle. So, and alternative production and all that and taking over the factory, you know, and that's the history of the left and especially the trade union movement when the grassroots, you know, overstep their rights by saying, okay, we're going to take over the whole factory and produce something else, that then this organizing powers, they have the power to organize, then they step back because, as I said before, they are in this trajectory. It was the same with the Lucas workers. I mean, of course, the management said, no, we're not going to produce what you suggest because we decide what is produced in our companies. But the TUC, the Trade Union Confederation in the UK, didn't support them, right? So that was another reason why they were not successful. So I'm sorry to say all these things, and I'm going to say another conflict. A French trade unionist organized a conference around lithium, and he invited the lithium workers from Chile. He invited the indigenous people who are the victims of this lithium mining, and he invited the workers in the global north in France that produce batteries. And that was amazing, I think. So that is a very good example of trying to organize globalized solidarity. But he said it was the most conflictual conference that he ever organized. Because what we need to see, and I think sometimes it's also good to see the contradictions and conflicts that exist, is that on an everyday basis, the interests of these three groups are conflictual, you know? The indigenous people say we are not surviving because of your mining, and the mining workers need to survive by mining, and same with the battery workers, and you don't know how to recycle the batteries. But the image of hope is if we start, or not we, because we're not, at least I'm not the organizer, I'm just talking about stuff. So if that could become fruitful, to discuss these contradictions and to understand at the same time that they are all exploited by the same powers. So although they have conflicting conference, they have also common interest. So I think the perspective is there because we need a global movement where the indigenous workers, the miners, and the workers in industry and the workers in the health sector and all of them get together and learn from each other. That is the hope that this might happen if a lot of trade unionists organize conferences like that. Thank you.
Okay, because of time, we're going to move quickly to our TULE lunch, if that's okay. So I'm going to just say a couple of things, make it as short and sweet because it's very late. But we also, if we can have tech put up the website, so it's tulelabor.org. I'm standing in front of a bunch of professors and we want you to support us and spread the word. So yeah, I don't need these two mics, do I?
Just one will be fine, I think.
It's just because the time of night, maybe you just need two mics. Okay, well, yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Okay, so what is TULE? You've heard a bunch of us talk about what TULE. TULE stands for Trade Union Labour Environmentalism and is a network formed after a panel, a conference in London like a year ago, where three of us and a few of us have kind of talked about this at this conference, but you know, you go to the conference and then maybe you have someone else on your panel who's kind of talking about climate change, labour unions, this kind of nexus. And so the idea came, okay, there was three of us on that panel. This is a growing research area. How do we kind of capture this and how do we kind of leverage it to kind of build out a research community? So the network's focus is on the role and function of trade unions in climate politics and the transition to a low-carbon economy. The purpose of the network is to make intellectual and ideological interventions into the theory, practice, and policy of trade union, labour environmentalism. So as a collective, we think that this research area has grown, like I say, and with our joint expertise across geographical locations that we're well positioned to make critical interventions. So although its origins comes out of a conference actually in London and it wasn't a joke, but there was an Irishman, a Scottishman, and we did go to a restaurant and then a pub. So yeah, but that's what it comes out of. But yeah, we have since built that out. We now have people across the kind of globe, someone in Germany, Philippines, Chile, and Spain. And yeah, we are looking to build solidarity. Like again, another kind of touch point that people talked about was the building solidarities across these geographies, particularly in the global south. And in that spirit, there's a few of us that will be presenting at the International Labour Process Conference in Santiago, Chile in April, with the aim of kind of fortifying these relationships. So far in although in our infancy, just to note a couple of things that we've achieved, we believe. So we've drafted a position paper, which you'll be able to see on our website, articulating our approach, our strategic orientation, and the type of interventions we hope to make. TULE sponsored this conference, which we hope will be a huge success. All of the organising committee, Jonathan, Evelyn, Christian, are all part of that network. And we're in the process of creating a podcast with the aim of giving a voice to workers' struggles and labour union struggles around the energy transition. So actually some of the kind of things, Nora, you touched on, there's a worker-led thing going on in Green Jobs Oshawa that we're bringing folks in to discuss, and we're also putting on some panels of practitioners, workers who are engaged in those historical materialism in Montreal in May, I believe, April it might be. So yeah, that's some of the things, and like I say, we've also launched our website. Where shout out to Isaac, who's helped us build that, and yeah, I'm going to share that in a moment. We have monthly meetings, which are designed to engage early career academics, including graduate and postdoc students who are research active. And as an emerging organisation, this conference is our public launch. So for over a year, we've been building this network on a volunteer basis with the hopes of securing additional resources in the coming year. So we encourage anyone that wants to support us in this endeavour of securing resources for early career academics who work at the intersection of labour, climate crisis and trade unions to get involved. And while we've intentionally maintained a membership focused on early career academics, which we class as postdocs, graduate students, we value the contributions of established professors, and we welcome your support, guidance, and potential collaboration, particularly through grant applications and future partnerships. We're also seeking to build relations with labour unions to support this critical work. And as you'll see on the programme, we had a couple of our locals that we are members of support this conference generously, which we're very grateful for, and we want to give a thanks for. And in terms of, just to finish up, sorry, to get involved, go to our website, tulelabor.org. That's TULE Labour with a OUR.org. There's a contact tab there with a form which you can fill out all your details, and someone will be in touch. I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks to everyone for joining, my TULE colleagues and my fellow committee members who supported this launch. Last but not least, we do have a donation link on our Eventbrite, which you would have registered with. If you have the means to make a contribution to support the volunteer effort, we would deeply appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.
So Christian is saying in the room that the security prevented us from sharing it right now on the Zoom because of the university parameters, but you can access it with the information in the chat if you want to do it online. So thank you very much to our two keynote speakers. It was really interesting and insightful. And thank you to all the presenters we had today. I think we're all looking forward to continuing all these discussions tomorrow. We start at 9 tomorrow officially, so a bit more time to sleep. Officially, I mean, yeah, that's the idea. So right now we have a little cocktail. Sorry for those online who couldn't join us, but for people in person, if you want to just go right next door, we have some drinks if you want to continue. And otherwise, people online, it was really nice. And we will see you tomorrow.